Just a Trend: Chinese Identity on TikTok by Nikki Cheng. Today, I'm presenting my research for a topic that honestly started from my own confusion scrolling through TikTok one day. You've probably seen the hashtags. Hashtag Chinese maxing, hashtag Chinese baddie, videos titled Gen Z is becoming Chinese, or I've been living a Chinese time lifestyle for a week. And at first glance, these trends might seem harmless, even kind of fun. But when I started looking closer, I had a lot of questions. What does it actually mean for being Chinese to become a trend? Who gets to participate in that? And what happens to real Chinese identity, the lived, complex, often painful experience of being Chinese, when it gets filtered through an algorithm? I'm going to dig into the cultural, historical, and social forces behind these TikTok trends and ask a question that I think is really important. When a culture goes viral, does that help the people from that culture? Or does it just make their identity into content for everyone else? Before I get into the academic frameworks, I want to ground us in what's actually happening in the media, because this trend didn't go unnoticed by journalists and commentators. Look at these headlines. The BBC asked, "Is this a very Chinese time in your life?" The trend boosting China's soft power. Forbes ran a piece called China Maxing, the message this Gen Z trend is sending US employers. And one outlet even wrote, "Some Gen Z Americans can't stop China Maxing." Now, what I found really interesting here is the range of reactions. Some outlets frame this as a positive cultural moment. Young people discovering and appreciating Chinese culture and wellness practices, food, and lifestyle habits. Others were much more suspicious. They asked whether this trend was actually functioning as a form of soft power or Beijing. Meaning, is China benefiting politically and diplomatically from the fact that young Americans are voluntarily embracing Chinese cultural markers? And that's a huge question that extends well beyond TikTok. Soft power, for those who aren't familiar with the term, refers to a country's ability to attract and influence others not through military force or economic pressure, but through culture, values, and lifestyle appeal. So when non-Chinese Gen Z users are voluntarily cooking Chinese food, drinking herbal teas, wearing house slippers, and calling themselves, quote, newly diagnosed Chinese, is that a grassroots cultural appreciation movement, or is it something more complicated? I don't think there's a clean answer, and honestly, that complexity is kind of the whole point of this presentation. The media coverage alone tells us that this trend is touching something bigger than just a fun social media challenge. So let's actually look at what these trends look like on the ground, or in this case on the app. The two most popular hashtags associated with this movement are Chinese maxing and Chinese baddie. And when you search these tags, what you find is a really wide range of content. You see videos like day one being a Chinese baddie, where someone's cooking a detox apple and cinnamon water on their stove. And you see videos of people drinking warm lemon tea saying, "First day being a Chinese baddie, I'll let you know how it goes." You see people doing their weekly grocery haul after recently being diagnosed Chinese, and their cart is full of bok choy, ginger, noodles, congee ingredients. You see content about drinking boiled apple water at night, and about wearing Chinese house slippers, about changing your morning routine to include ginger and spleen tonifying foods based on traditional Chinese medicine. And here's where the language gets really interesting to me as an anthropology student. The phrase, quote, late diagnosed Chinese or newly diagnosed Chinese is being used almost like a joke. Like, oops, turns out I've been Chinese this whole time and I didn't know about it. It's framed as a discovery of some sort of lifestyle upgrade or a wellness journey. And that framing is doing a lot of work. It's taking practices that are deeply embedded in Chinese cultural and medicinal traditions, practices that Chinese people were often mocked for, or they were seen as unhygienic or strange by Western standards, and repackaging them as aspirational. Suddenly, drinking warm water instead of cold, wearing house slippers indoors, eating congee for breakfast, these things are now cool, they're trendy, they're content. But here's what we have to ask. Who benefits when this shift happens, and who is already living those practices quietly, maybe even being shamed for them long before they became a TikTok trend? Here's some more examples that continue to confuse me, especially as a Chinese American person. Now, there's something genuinely funny and lighthearted about a lot of this content, and I don't want to dismiss that entirely. Humor and internet culture are real cultural forces. But when I step back and look at the pattern, I start asking myself, what is actually being claimed here? What does it mean to be newly Chinese? Is Chinese identity something you can try on for a week Is it a lifestyle you can just adapt and discard when the trend fades? For people who are actually Chinese, who grew up navigating racism, who were told their food smelled weird, who were called slurs, who faced discrimination, especially during COVID-19, watching their cultural practices become a trend performed largely by non-Chinese creators raises some really complicated feelings. And those feelings aren't just about being offended. I think there's something deeper about it, about whose labor and history makes a culture and who gets to claim the benefits when that culture becomes fashionable. I think these are the kinds of questions I want to sit with as we move into the more theoretical frameworks I used. So this brings me to my formal research question. How has TikTok reshaped perceptions of Chinese identity? And I've broken this down to 3 main threads that I'll be tracing throughout the rest of the presentation. First, we'll look at the rise of Chinese cultural trends, the actual content, hashtags, behaviors, aesthetics that are all being packaged and spread on TikTok. Second, I'll talk about the increased visibility, because on the surface, having Chinese culture be widely seen and embraced seems positive, and of course representation matters as well as visibility, but the visibility alone doesn't really tell us the whole story. And third, I'll examine the shift in how Chinese identity is being understood, not just by the outsiders looking in, but potentially also by the Chinese Americans and diaspora communities themselves, who may be processing what it means to see their culture go viral. And I want to be clear that I'm not arguing TikTok is purely bad or that culture exchange is inherently harmful. Culture has always moved across borders. Humans have always borrowed from each other, but TikTok operates at a scale and speed that is genuinely new, and the platform structure, the algorithm, participation, the trend cycles, they all shape cultural exchange in ways that are worth examining. My thesis is that TikTok trends reshape Chinese identity through 3 interconnected mechanisms: digital Orientalism, cultural appropriation, and aestheticization of culture. And the result of all 3 of these working together is that Chinese culture becomes a form of entertainment, something to be consumed, performed, and cycled through, rather than something understood in its actual context, history, and complexity. I'll break each of these down before I go into them in more detail in the next slides. Digital Orientalism is a way that older, historically rooted Western biases about the East are now being reproduced in online spaces, on social media, content creation, and how algorithms surface certain kinds of cultural content. Cultural appropriation is the adoption of elements from minority culture by members of a dominant culture, often without credit or accountability, and usually in ways that benefit the person borrowing rather than the source community. And aestheticization is the process by which complex living cultural practices get flattened into visuals and aesthetics, which strip their original meaning and turned into look or a lifestyle brand. All 3 of these things are happening on TikTok with Chinese culture right now. And I want to argue is that they don't just reflect pre-existing biases, they actively reproduce and reinforce them, even when the intent is appreciation or admiration. So how does TikTok work? TikTok is built for rapid spread. Its algorithm is extraordinarily good at identifying what content a user is likely to engage with and pushing similar content to them immediately. Unlike other social media platforms that were primarily about following people you already knew, TikTok's For You page is curated almost entirely by the algorithm. You could have 0 followers and still go viral if your content hits the right signals. This creates a culture of rapid trend imitation. When a format goes viral, say day 1 of being a Chinese baddie, the algorithm rewards people who participate in that format. So users see it, imitate it, and the trend spreads exponentially. Content can go from a niche video to a global phenomenon in days or even hours. And crucially, TikTok is designed not just for passive viewing, but for active participation. There's a duet feature or a stitch feature. All of it encourages users to take existing content and then add themselves to it. This is part of what makes TikTok so powerful as a cultural force. It doesn't just show you the culture, it invites you to perform it. But that participatory structure also means that when a culture trend takes off, it can be reproduced by thousands of people with very little knowledge of or connection to the actual culture being referenced. The platform doesn't ask you to do research before making a video. It doesn't ask you to consult anyone. It's really just, can you make something engaging? Edward Said's 1978 book Orientalism is one of the most foundational texts in post-colonial studies. Said argued that the West, meaning Europe and later the US, constructed a particular image of the East, which he called the Orient, that served Western interests. The Orient was portrayed as exotic, mysterious, and fundamentally inferior or different from the rational, progressive West. And it wasn't just about cultural stereotypes. It was really tied into the real political and colonial power that the West had used to justify domination over Eastern peoples and their territories. So digital Orientalism is what happens when those same frameworks move into online spaces. In digital environments, China gets represented through a very specific set of lenses: cutting-edge technology and surveillance, global economic power and threat, and aesthetic elements like jade, silk, lanterns, herbal medicine. These representations are often disconnected from the lived reality of Chinese people, both in China and in the diaspora. On TikTok specifically, you see digital Orientalism operating in how Chinese culture gets packaged. It becomes about the aesthetics, the teas, the slippers, the specific foods, while the complexity of what it means to be Chinese, the diversity within Chinese communities, political realities, and history of discrimination, all of that gets edited out. What remains is a simplified, consumable version of Chineseness that feels exotic enough to be interesting, but familiar enough to be accessible. And the algorithm amplifies this. Content that plays into recognizable cultural markers performs well. It gets all the engagement, all the clicks. And so creators are incentivized to lean into the aesthetic, the Chinese aesthetic, rather than the actual complex reality. The second major concept I want to dig into is cultural appropriation, which is one of those terms that kind of gets thrown around a lot, but is worth defining very carefully. Cultural appropriation, at its core, refers to the adoption or use of elements from one culture by members of a different culture, specifically in contexts where there's significant power imbalance between the two groups. It's often characterized by the borrowing happening without full context or the credit, and without the historical meaning of the practice being understood or respected. And critically, it tends to benefit the person borrowing while the originating community continues to face disadvantage. And I want to acknowledge that the line between appropriation and appreciation is very blurry, and people debate it a lot. Cultural exchange has always happened. Cultures have never been static or sealed off from one another, and there is really something meaningful about someone outside of a culture taking true and genuine interest to learn about it. But the key question is, what is the power dynamic, and who gets to be cool for doing something, and who gets to be stigmatized for it? When a Chinese kid brings stinky tofu, which is the actual name of the dish, to school and gets mocked, but then a non-Chinese creator makes a video about eating Chinese street food and gets like 300,000 likes, that asymmetry matters. When Chinese people wearing traditional dress in daily life get stared or bothered at, but non-Chinese creators adapting Chinese aesthetic elements get praised, or for being cultured and interesting, that asymmetry also matters. On TikTok, the quote Chinese maxing and quote Chinese baddie trends involve largely non-Chinese creators adopting Chinese wellness and lifestyle practices, which is like the warm water drinking, the teas, kanji, house shoes, specific sleep routines, and framing these as lifestyle upgrades or interesting experiments. The practices are being detached from their origin and adopted as trends. Users participate because they view these things as acceptable to try. They've been aestheticized enough that they feel like they're fair game. But the communities that those practices come from rarely get credit and rarely get to define what their practices mean, and rarely receive the social capital that non-Chinese creators gain from participating in the trend. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Chinese and Chinese American communities experienced a dramatic rise in anti-Asian hate. The rhetoric around the Chinese virus, language used at the highest levels of government even, contributed to a climate where Asian people were verbally and physically attacked. People were afraid to go to Chinatown. Elders were pushed on the street. People were spat on or coughed on, basically just being harassed. The Stop Asian Hate movement emerged as a direct response to this violence. And yet, just a few years later, we're seeing Chinese culture trending on TikTok. The same country that was calling COVID the quote Chinese virus is now producing viral content about living your best Chinese lifestyle. The same culture whose food and habits were called dirty or dangerous are now being aestheticized as healthy, ancient, and aspirational. So on one hand, you might see this as progress, as a cultural connection, or a recalibration. And in some ways, the increased positive visibility Chinese cultural practices is meaningful. Representation and normalization do really matter. But I do want to push back on with the phrase that I put on the slide, that visibility does not equal equity. The people making these trends are largely not the people who face the hate crimes. The communities whose practices are being adopted are still navigating discrimination. And they're still fighting for their safety and also still being unrepresented in media and politics in very meaningful ways. The trend doesn't just undo all of this harm that they've experienced. And in some ways, it adds a new layer of complexity, because now Chinese Americans also have to navigate what it means to watch their culture become a performance for others, a commodity, or basically a moment, someone else's content calendar. The shift from stigmatization, to aestheticization is real, but it's not the same as justice. And I think it's important to name that clearly. Throughout this presentation, I've been building up 3 interconnected frameworks for understanding what's happening when Chinese culture trends on TikTok. Orientalism gives us the historical lens. It reminds us that Western perceptions of Chinese culture didn't begin on TikTok. They have deep roots in centuries of colonial thinking, political power, and cultural othering. These roots are still active, and they shape what gets noticed, what gets aestheticized, and what gets dismissed. Digital Orientalism is how those frameworks are now operating in online spaces. TikTok algorithm amplifies simplified and aestheticized versions of Chinese culture because they perform well, and they're able to be consumed and fit the formats of what viewers want to see. And in doing so, the platform reproduces Orientalist dynamics even when no individual creator intends any harm. And cultural appropriation describes the user behavior, the pattern of adoption without context, and gaining social capital from practices that the originating community never got social capital for. Together, these 3 things create a situation where Chinese culture becomes aestheticized, turning it into aesthetic, a vibe, or some type of trend, rather than it being engaged in with its actual depth and context. And when this happens, these trends don't just reflect existing power dynamics between cultures, they truly just actively reinforce them. And they tell us that your culture is interesting to consume, but you as a person or a political subject, it's a bit of a different and more harder conversation to talk about. I want to be clear that I'm not saying everyone who participates in these trends has bad intentions. Most people are really just trying to have fun. They want to be part of something bigger, or just really try something new. But intentions don't determine impact. And as an anthropology student who is someone who has been viewing culture and power, I think it's really important to look at how these impacts are affecting cultures. So the next time you see a China maxing video on your For You page, I hope this gives you a framework for thinking more critically about what you're actually seeing. And that is the end of my presentation. Thank you so much for listening.